Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to try to get into a really a fascinating question, and honestly, it's a little bit disturbing too. And that is, what is going on in the mind of a serial killer?
Right.
Like, what are the things that drive these people? It's a question that I think has just been around forever, and we've been combing through a lot of different research that tries to get at the potential origins of where this behavior might come from, the psychology behind it, and we really want to try to extract like the most important things that we're learning from all this research and help you, the listener, navigate this really difficult topic without, feeling totally overwhelmed. You've mentioned wanting to like get a grip on things quickly, but without missing the nuance. And we hear that. We really do. So, yeah. Today, we're going to be looking at the psychology behind serial killers. Like, what might be some of the causes of these behaviors? How do we categorize these offenders? I mean, it's complicated. There's no easy answer.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're talking about multiple layers here, right? Like you've got to think about potential, biological things, predispositions, if you will, but then of course the impact of their lived experiences, right?
For sure. And that kind of leads us right into this debate that's been raging for ages, right? I mean,
Mm.
are serial killers, are they born evil? Like, are they born with something that's just inherently bad, or are they completely shaped by their experiences? It's that classic nature versus nurture question. But obviously, when we're talking about this subject matter, the stakes are a little higher.
Absolutely. And, while we can't definitively say it's one or the other, we can say that the research points to some pretty strong pattern. Childhood trauma seems to be a huge factor. We're talking abuse, neglect, instability in the family, social isolation. These things just keep popping up in the backgrounds of so many of these individuals. Like, it's not just a coincidence, it's a pattern.
So this is where things get really, really complicated and, to be honest, a bit unsettling. Have you ever heard of the McDonald triad?
Yeah, I've come across it.
Okay, so for our listeners who haven't, this theory tries to link certain childhood behaviors, things like cruelty to animals, setting fires, and then even bedwetting, prolonged bedwetting. It tries to link those things to future violent behavior
Yeah.
and, possibly becoming a serial offender. But this is super controversial, right?
Yeah.
So what are the arguments like for and against it being valid?
Yeah. Okay, so the first thing to remember is that just because a kid does one of these things, hurts an animal or whatever, it does not mean that they're going to grow up to be a violent criminal. Like, that's just not how it works. Lots of kids do these things, and they turn out just fine. The thing is, we do see these behaviors in the history of some serial killers. I mean, more often than you might think. And so because of that correlation, researchers, they're paying attention. They're trying to see if these early childhood disturbances could be like, I don't know, red flags, maybe a sign of deeper issues. But it's a correlation, not a direct cause and effect thing, right? And it's certainly not some foolproof test.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. So we're seeing that these early experiences like really matter, but then what about the physical brain itself? What's happening up there in the brain of somebody who is actually capable of this level of violence?
All right, so this is where things get really fascinating. Neuroscience is starting to give us some insights, although, to be honest, a lot of it's still pretty inconclusive. But what we are seeing is that some serial killers, they have differences in their brain activity and even the structure of their brains. And these differences tend to show up in certain areas, like the prefrontal cortex, for example. And then there's the amygdala. Now, the prefrontal cortex, this part of the brain, it's super important. It helps us control our impulses, make decisions. It's like the brain's brake pedal. And the amygdala, this is all about processing emotions, things like empathy and fear.
Right. So if these parts of the brain are different or not working the way they should, what does that mean, like behaviorally?
Well, it could mean that someone has a harder time controlling themselves.
Huh.
Like their ability to regulate their behavior is weaker, and they may not fully grasp the emotional impact of their actions on other people, right? Because if those neural circuits for empathy aren't firing the way they should, their internal brakes, the things that stop most of us from hurting others, those might be much weaker.
Man, that's a chilling thought. And then there's all this stuff about the MAOA gene. You know, some people call it the warrior gene. Like, what's that all about? How does that fit in?
Okay, so the AOA gene, what it does is it helps regulate these neurotransmitters in our brains. These neurotransmitters are the things that affect our mood, our aggression levels. And some studies suggest that if someone has certain versions of this gene, variations, and if they also had a really tough childhood, like say they were abused, that combination might make them more likely to be aggressive. But here's the thing, and this is really important. Just because you have that gene variant, it doesn't mean you're destined to become violent. It's just not that simple.
So like you said earlier, it's not just one thing. It's more about how all these different factors interact.
Exactly. It's a complex cocktail. You might have some biological vulnerabilities, maybe even some genetic predispositions, but then you throw in some seriously damaging environmental influences, and that's where things can go really wrong. None of these factors work in isolation, right?
So let's dig into those broader influences, those social and environmental factors.
Mhm.
You were talking earlier about chaotic upbringings. What does that really mean? Like, how does that actually affect a person?
Okay. So imagine you're a child growing up in a home where violence is just a normal thing. Like it's just part of everyday life. And maybe there's no love or it's inconsistent, conditional. You feel invisible, powerless. These kinds of experiences can really mess you up. It can totally distort how you understand relationships, boundaries, even the value of human life itself. Like the damage can run really deep.
And so then how does society as a whole contribute to this? I mean, it feels like it's this very individual, very internal thing, right? But surely there's a bigger picture here.
Absolutely. Think about how we portray violence in the media. I mean, sometimes it's presented in a way that almost desensitizes people to it. And in very rare cases, it can even give twisted inspiration. But it's not just the media. It's also those broader societal forces that make certain groups of people feel marginalized, dehumanized. And that can, unfortunately, create a climate where these perpetrators, they feel less inhibited about targeting those people. Like, it's just wrong. And then you have to consider that some of these serial killers, they want the fame, the notoriety. They thrive on the fear they create. And our media doesn't always help. Sometimes it just ends up amplifying that.
Yeah. It's this messed up cycle. And then another thing that our research touched on is that once a killer actually gets away with it, once they do it and they don't get caught right away, there's this almost like compulsion to do it again. And usually it escalates. Like, how does that cycle even start? What's happening there?
Well, if you think about it, the first time they do something so horrific and they don't face consequences, they experience this feeling of control, of power. It can be really intense, especially for someone who's felt powerless their whole life. And that fuels this cycle. It reinforces this idea that they have power. And each time they do it, it erodes what little internal resistance they might have had. And so it becomes a way to fulfill this deep-seated need that they have.
Now, I know the FBI, they've created this whole system for classifying serial killers, right?
Yeah.
And it's based on their motives. So we're categorizing the why behind these terrible acts.
Exactly. The FBI, they are trying to understand what these killers are hoping to achieve. What are their psychological needs? And understanding those motivations, that's the key to getting inside their heads, or at least trying to.
Okay, let's go through those categories. So first we've got visionary killers.
Yeah.
What are the driving forces behind these guys?
So these killers, they are often just detached from reality, right? They might hear voices, have hallucinations, maybe they think they're on some divine mission, something really big. They're reacting to all these internal stimuli, stuff that's going on in their heads, which, I mean, that can be incredibly powerful. And from the outside looking in, it can be really hard to understand. David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, he claimed he was just doing what this demon dog told him to do. That's a classic example.
Then there are the mission-oriented killers. Their reasons for doing what they do, they seem a little more grounded, at least in their own minds, but no less disturbing, right?
Right. So the mission-oriented killers, they believe they're like cleaning up society. Getting rid of a specific group of people they see as undesirable or evil. They feel like it's their duty to do this. It's all very twisted, but that's their justification. It's rooted in their own messed up belief system.
And then there's the hedonistic killer. This one's really chilling to me.
Yeah.
Because they're all about the pleasure they get from it.
Yeah, the pleasure is the whole point for them. And it can take different forms. Some, they're turned on by it. They get sexual gratification from killing. And then there are others, they're driven by the thrill, the power, the rush of taking a life. Jeffrey Dahmer, he wanted sexual gratification and control. He's a classic example.
And lastly, there's the power and control killers. I mean, it feels like dominance is a factor in a lot of these crimes, isn't it?
You're absolutely right. Power and control, I mean, those are big underlying themes for a lot of these guys. But for these specific killers, power and control, that's their main thing. They need to completely dominate their victims. And for them, killing is like the ultimate expression of that power. Ted Bundy, he planned everything so meticulously. He was all about manipulation. He's a classic example of a power and control killer.
It's really heavy stuff. And I think what our research is saying is that no matter what the motive is, it doesn't make it any less tragic for the victims and their families.
Exactly. Like these categories, they help us try to understand, but the pain that's caused, the damage,
Mm,
it doesn't change.
right. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the cases you mentioned. Ted Bundy, he's one that always gets me because he was so charming.
Yeah.
He was smart. But then, underneath it all, there's this monster who committed over 30 murders. Talk about a split personality.
Ted Bundy is a perfect example that you can't judge a book by its cover, right?
Yep.
He used his charm, his intelligence, he used it all to manipulate people, his victims, everyone around him. But underneath, it was all about power and control. And the fact that he was able to avoid justice for so long, deny everything, play the system, that just shows how hard it is to catch these guys and truly understand how twisted they are.
Then there's Jeffrey Dahmer. His crimes, they were just so, so disturbing. I mean, he was obsessed with controlling his victims. And then, the things he did, they're just unspeakable.
Dahmer, he was all about control. He wanted to possess his victims, literally and figuratively. He tried to preserve their bodies. He was into cannibalism and necrophilia. It was all about fighting his own loneliness in this really messed up way. His cases, it's like a textbook example of how extreme mental illness can lead to unthinkable acts of brutality. Looking at his motivations, it's a reminder of how severe psychological breakdown can have these just unbelievably horrific consequences.
And then there's Aileen Wuornos. Her case, it really gets people talking, because was she a serial killer or was she a victim who just finally snapped after so much abuse?
Hmm.
It's the tough one.
Yeah. Aileen Wuornos had a really rough life. She was abused, exploited, and all of her victims, they were men, and she claimed that many of them had either assaulted her or tried to. So that raises a lot of questions, right? It makes you think about victims, about self-defense, about how we define a serial killer. Was she just a predator, or was it more than that? Like, did she take revenge to a whole other level because of what she'd been through? It's a really complex case, and it shows how hard it is to label people, especially in these kinds of situations.
All of this leads us to a big question.
Hmm.
Can we stop this from happening? Can we figure out who's on this path before they do something terrible? I mean, that's where profiling comes in, right? Right. Trying to find the patterns, the characteristics.
Yeah, so profilers, they look at behavior patterns, they look at backgrounds, and anything else that might link them to other serial killers. And they use all that information to help law enforcement, figure out who they might be looking for, what they might be like, how they might operate.
But the research is clear. This isn't some kind of perfect science. So where does profiling fall short? What are the limitations?
Well, profiling, it's basically based on statistics and patterns from past cases. And while it can be helpful for narrowing down suspects, it's not foolproof. People are unpredictable, and if you focus too much on a profile, you might miss someone who doesn't fit the mold. It's a tool, but it's not a crystal ball.
And even though we try to understand the warning signs,
Hmm.
it feels like, as a society, we're not very good at actually seeing them,
Yeah.
or doing anything about it. Why is that? What do you think?
There are probably a few reasons. Sometimes we just don't recognize those early signs. Like, remember the McDonald triad? Maybe we see those behaviors, but we don't realize how serious they could be. And then sometimes people who might be at risk, they just fall through the cracks, and they never get the help they need. Or maybe the resources just aren't there. And then you have cases like Ted Bundy, where someone can seem totally normal on the surface, but they're hiding this deep darkness. I mean, how do you spot that? It's incredibly difficult.
It's true. It's true. Okay, so last question. Why are we so fascinated by serial killers? It's dark, right? But it's definitely there. What do you think is going on there?
Honestly, that's a question that's still being debated, but my guess is it's part of our need to understand the extremes of human behavior to make sense of evil, especially when it seems to make no sense. Maybe by studying them, we're trying to understand this part of humanity that we can't even fathom. What happens when someone just doesn't have empathy?
Yeah. Like we're trying to wrap our heads around something that seems so outside of our own morality, our own understanding of the world. And maybe by doing that, we're also trying to understand ourselves better.
Exactly. It forces us to look at some uncomfortable truths about human nature, about the potential for darkness that we all have.
So to sum up this deep dive, it seems like the mind of a serial killer is a tangled mess of early trauma, possible neurological differences, and a toxic social environment. And then on top of all that, you have all these different motives driving them.
Yeah, it's a complex picture for sure. And what we learn from all this is there's no single explanation. Like each case is unique, even though we see these patterns emerge in the research.
And this brings us to our final thought for you, the listener.
We've talked about the complicated mix of factors that might create a serial killer, this interplay of biology, environment, their own choices. So now think about this. What does that tell us about human behavior in general? Does it mean that all of us, or at least society as a whole, has the potential for darkness? It's a tough question, and it's one that I hope you'll keep thinking about.